This is the only world history book I've seen that puts China's history in the same chapter as a chapter on the Roman Empire. In fact, these authors did not do it until about the 5th or 6th edition. It's only been about 6 or 7 years ago that they started doing it. The reason for that being, they want you to notice that there are some similarities between what was going on in China, what was going on in Europe. I mean, hey, China's on one side of the supercontinent of Eurasia, Europe's on the other side, and they experienced a lot of things that were similar, and a lot of things were different. But for the one and only time in history you had both this area and this area united, then this area fragmented and never could reunite itself. This area fragmented for a time also, but it remained, it did reunite itself and went on to remain united to this day. All right, the period of time we're talking about is the 400-year period of the Han Dynasty. Han Dynasty came in, your book gives the dates, around 200 BCE and ended around approximately 200 CE. Those dates are round figures.
Do you have to go back?
No, don't worry about the dates. Just give some idea, it's about the same time period we're talking about. The Roman Empire in 200 BCE was fighting the Punic War, so it was still under the Republic. And then in 200 CE, it was noticeably in a state of decay, where they had all kinds of problems that they never did really solve. Now, one thing I want you to notice, in both of these empires, the population went up and up and up to a certain point, and then it leveled off and declined. The population in China declined after about 100 or so CE. The population of Europe declined about the same time. As to what led to the decline, probably the main culprit was climate change in a form of cooling down. When the climate cooled, farmers would plant thinking, hey, the crops will grow like they did. So let's say, hey, we always plant by April 20th. So this year we're going to plant on April 20th. They plant their seed on April 20th, and a big frost come right about the time the seed was coming up, destroy their crop. Well, okay, this is an unlucky year. I'll just plant what's left of some of my seeds. So they plant again a little bit more. And the seed would come up, and it would not get a frost, but the problem was the heat, the sun would never get as hot, as I say, the sun would not as hot as it needed to be for that kind of plant to survive. Then the first frost in the fall would come before that plant had matured. And the result was they lose an entire crop, the people would starve, the resistance to disease would lower, plagues would come in and take over. The climate change brought about storms that also would oftentimes destroy crops. And all told, it was a bad time, and the bad scenario led to rioting, blaming the government, blaming the emperor, and this occurred on both sides of the continent of Eurasia, supercontinent, you want to say, of Eurasia. Rome went through a period where they killed some 24 emperors in 50 years. China went through a period where it killed one of its leading emperors. So it led to turbulent times on both sides. Now, the main religion in China during this period of time was Confucianism. I'll have a little bit more to say about that later, but
Bless you.
Confucius, I'll write it down, I've already mentioned it, but yeah, just make sure that you see it in dark, bold print. Now, during this time period, China started something that had never been seen before in human history, the civil service exam. Now, the reason for the start of the civil service exam was to try to make sure that only smart people got government positions. Now, I had a student ask me, how can you be sure that a high test score will make you a good leader Today, we're pretty well sure that it can't. Not necessarily. But the Chinese people believe that a person who scored the highest on a government test was more qualified than anyone else to serve in a government position. Now, what they had, and this is something that all societies have, before this time, government positions have been a matter of if you were born into it, if your father was a government official and you were his oldest son, when your father died, you'd get the government position. The problem was a whole lot of times the oldest son was not at all qualified, not at all suited. And like in the case of Nebo, I had a student ask me this morning, was Nebo insane? Likely not. He just simply was not suited for the job he was called on to do. Yeah, likely he was sane, likely he was mentally competent, I mean, at least as far as he had his mind about him, but he was simply not qualified to be emperor. Have any of you heard of a psychological principle, called the Peter Principle? I had students several years ago, several of them apparently, and one teacher here was teaching it. In the Peter Principle, you don't ever go higher up the bureaucratic ladder than your abilities allow you to go. Now, if you're in the Army and you become a major, you might do well as a major, then become a lieutenant colonel and flop as a lieutenant colonel. Because your abilities were major, qualified you as a major, but when they put that silver maple leaf on you, all of a sudden you couldn't handle it. In World War II, Hitler wound up putting stars on men who simply could not handle the responsibility of stars. A lot of men who have done really well on this level of bureaucracy move them up to the next level and they simply can't handle it. Anyway, the civil service exam was designed to try to make sure that only qualified people got into positions. It had its limitations. For one thing, it was the nearest thing that mankind had at that time to a somewhat leveling. In other words, where you got promoted based on ability, not on birth. However, that must be said tongue-in-cheek because what they did, the rich set up academies where only rich children could get into the academies and the poor could not afford an academy. The word academy means private school. It still does. When you say academy, you know that means it's not a government-supported school that takes in everybody. The Chinese did not have free public education for everyone. So they had academies, and only the rich got in, so therefore only the rich got a chance to take the civil service exam. Only the rich had a chance to pass. Now there were some exceptions. Occasionally someone would spot a really, really brilliant young boy from a poor family and decide, hey, I can train this fella, educate him, and make something out of him, take him from his parents and educate him and make something out of him. Occasionally, one would move up. The civil service exam was to spread from China to Japan to Korea to Vietnam, but it was slow coming to the West. In fact, it was till the 1700s when European nations began to adopt it. We have it here in this country. Supposedly you can get a job with the executive branch of government if you have a high score on a civil service exam. If you've ever served in the military, they give you 5 points for having taken the exam. Those exams were not multiple choice tests like a lot of our government exams are today. Oftentimes they involve rote memorization, how well you can memorize long passages from Confucius. Or they involve essay questions. And a lot of them were based on Confucius. Again, like I said, the first candidates were almost always from wealthy aristocratic families. And still, a lot of persons who were older sons failed the exam because they were not smart enough. And this did help to guarantee that the totally incompetent persons did not get to take the exam and did not get put in a position for which they were not suited. Now, a big problem the Chinese had was court, factionalism in court. If a man happened to be born the son of an emperor and he became emperor, he had to be really careful because a lot of times he was controlled by various eunuchs who were in the palace or high up officials, and all he could do was service ceremonial functions and had no real authority. Now, folk, if you look at the office of king all the way down through the ages, whether it be in Europe or Asia, half of your men and women who have held the office of king and queen have been nothing more than mere figureheads. This is true in Japan, true in China, true in India. They've been completely controlled. And of course, in Great Britain right now, they don't even allow the Queen to speak her opinion. Queen Elizabeth II once expressed an opinion many years ago, and Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher scolded her severely that you're not to say anything about that, you're to keep your mouth shut. If there's any opinion, I'll express the opinions around here and not you. This actually happened, folks. The Queen is not even allowed to express an opinion on matters. But again, that's built into Britain's law and constitution. But half your kings and queens down through the ages have been totally at the mercy of the courts. The Tsar of Russia, you might think he was a total autocrat. Many a Tsar wound up going to prison for no fault of his, just the political winds, or somebody else in the family would come in and with a bigger army, more troops, and take over. I mean, even among the Tsars. Again, half of your kings down through the ages have not been able to assert themselves, have not been able to rule, owing to the fact that kings have to surround themselves with advisors. And when that king dies, he has no way of knowing what these advisors will do to his son, if they'll allow his son to rule, or if they'll allow his son to or even if they'll kill his son. He has no way of knowing. But anyway, court intrigues brought down many a Chinese emperor, or kept a lot of them who were not brought down, kept them in silence. Looking at page 146, the economy, they had the same problem that mankind has had throughout the ages. A man might get a farm and pass it on to his children, grandchildren for 100 years, but then inevitably would come a generation where that someone might be wounded in war or might be incompetent, and his family would lose most of the farm. They'd have to sell the farm, and inevitably your farmers found themselves losing their farms to the rich neighbors. The rich got all of the land. The poor became what we call tenant farmers. I'm not going to write that down, but basically a tenant. On a very personal note, my uncles used to condemn my maternal grandfather because he paid rent to a rich landlady for many years. And why did he buy? Somehow they didn't realize my grandfather didn't have the option of going to a bank and taking out a 30-year loan, where after 30 years of paying the bank, he'd own the place. That did not exist at the time. Now, late in life, my grandfather was able to buy a plot of land and own it, but for many years he paid rent. Most tenant farmers, their rent is so high, and what they get to keep is so little that they simply cannot become wealthy or cannot get out. So they're permanently indebted to their landlord. The Chinese farmers became tenant farmers. For a while, food production increased steadily, and this was largely because they had longer, hotter summers. In other words, global warming made for better food production. But then came the cooling down. Folks, again, these things occur in cycles. And to me, the idea that man can control it is utterly, totally preposterous. For all we know, it's caused by the sun heating up. I mean, hey, folks, a few years ago, they tried to say that, hey, it looks like Neptune and Jupiter and Saturn and Uranus are warming up also. Well, what does man-made global warming have to do with that warming up? Then I didn't hear anything about that for a while. But we used to believe that the sun's output was constant. Now we know, hey, no, it isn't. The output of stars varies, sometimes really greatly. And the output of our sun is now known to vary also. Fact is, we don't know why the climate cooled and why it would warm up. There's still a lot about this we don't know. Oh yeah, the Chinese farmers used iron plows, and that's interesting because for many generations, Europeans would not use iron plows, thinking that iron hurt the soil. In fact, as recently as the late 1700s, a lot of colonial farmers in our own country would not use iron plows. Again, thinking that but the Chinese were using iron plows. They also learned to harness their horses at his shoulder and not at his neck. And again, this should be obvious. The horse could pull a much greater load with his harness harnessed at his shoulder than they could with it harnessed at his neck. And your book talks about natural fertilizers. The only thing I want to say about that, that involves human and animal waste, which is great as far as making a great yield. It's also bad as far as spreading certain parasites. Certain parasites can be spread that way. Eventually, though, farmers had an average of about 1 acre per family, which was not enough to really support them. Because basically, China's farmers became poorer and poorer as time went on. China's farmers faced problems with compulsory military service. Hey, during our world wars and Vietnam War also, farm workers were exempt from the military because there were so few of them. So if you lived on a farm, you were exempt. But in China, they couldn't exempt their farmers because 90% of people were farmers. So a farmer, young man who grew up on a farm would find himself called into military service. And while he was gone, his family was doing without his services. Now, taxes. Now this is something I have not mentioned, but a lot of persons say that heavy taxes was a big culprit in the fall of the Roman Empire. Heavy taxes also was a big problem for the Chinese. Taxes. And what happened was, as the population got less, both sides of the supercontinent, as the population got less, taxes got higher, as if the people could afford to pay them. Manufacturing. Oh yeah, something else. Both sides of the supercontinent did. Your book says that Chinese emperors, when they realized they better not take their own farmers away from the farms, they began recruiting troops from the edges of their country. And folk, this reminds us the Roman emperors did the same thing. And this wound up having disastrous effect, both here and here. Eventually these mercenary troops turned on the Chinese, and the result was disastrous. You know, both sides had a whole lot in common.